So the South African National Roads Agency has announced that tenders worth just over 17 billion rand have been cancelled. Suspected failure to comply with some board directives on tender issuing processes is stated as just one of the reasons. Those tenders were meant to build some of the country's major infrastructure development projects. This makes sense of the implications of this development and bring in Sanral spokesperson Vusi Mona, who joins us via our video link this morning. It's great to see you, sir. Thanks very much indeed for making time to speak to us. My understanding is that, these tenders have been cancelled because of concerns in part that were raised by the board. What were some of these concerns?
Well, at the heart of the cancellation is a board resolution that required design consultants not to be involved in the evaluation. Design consultants, they do the specs for our projects. And in the past, they would get involved in a panel that sought to evaluate the tenders. Now, board, in its wisdom, thought that could possibly constitute a conflict of interest and directed that design consultants should not be involved in evaluation. Now, all 5 tenders in question here, that board resolution was not adhered to and thus compromised the tendering process.
Right. Had any monies been paid out, and if so, are there plans to try and recoup it?
Look, that is still going to be determined. Obviously, where work has been done, people would naturally have builders, and it remains to be seen if indeed we've paid monies that we need to recoup. But what is critical is that a board decision was not adhered to. And if that happens, the process is compromised.
Got you. Difficult to recoup the money in the context, though, where work has been done.
Almost definitely. There are ways in the public sector that we deal with these. If you spend money and you did not have approval, it's unauthorized expenditure, and there's ways to deal with it. You could apply for a condemnation. Board or National Treasury, where it's supposed to go to National Treasury, could grant the condemnation or decline the condemnation.
How far back do these tenders go, and at which stage did the board realize that some of their directives hadn't been followed?
I think the decision was made in January 2020. I think it first came to board's attention in December last year, that its resolution had not been adhered to.
Yeah, I'm sure you can see where I'm going with this. There had been some time from when the board had finally picked up that its own resolutions weren't followed. By then, a lot could have taken place in those months. It does shine a spotlight, doesn't it, on perhaps some of the processes within Sanral that could be improved in the wake of what's taken place?
Well, it first became apparent to board in December. There were internal discussions, there was an exchange of documents, board seeking to understand what had happened. We are now in May, and hardly 4 or 5 months thereafter, the argument could be made that perhaps we should have announced that immediately it came to board's attention. But you'd also accept the fact that board needed time to understand what had actually gone wrong.
And in that time, did the process stop or did it continue? Because if money was paid out and work was being done, but it wasn't meant to have been done to begin with, it certainly puts Sanral in a murky situation that's going to be difficult to get out of.
I don't understand what murky situation.
Well, you've just admitted that some money could have possibly been paid out and shouldn't have because there were issues with the tenders in question. And
let me just clarify, that money would have been paid to the design consultants, right, and not for the construction of the projects. I think it's very important to make that distinction.
Yes. Okay, let's go back then. Had work been done to warrant that money being issued out?
Yes, if people have been appointed and they're under the impression that It's a legitimate appointment, and they would do the work and they would bill.
And that's why I'm saying it's a bit complex now, because there were people who thought this was a legitimate process. It turns out it might have not been a legitimate process. How do you ask those people to pay back money when, in fact, they've worked for the money they've received?
No one has suggested that money must be paid back. The people who paid the monies will need to explain why that happened, and then there are processes in the public sector that would require them to either ask for condonation or accept responsibility. We'll cross the bridge when we get there, but there is no expectation for monies to be paid back by the design consultants that have done the work.
Right. What impact is this going to have on infrastructure build? Because obviously these tenders, I imagine, would have to be reissued once the board has satisfied itself that all its directives are being followed.
Oh yes, board yesterday actually announced that it expects these tenders to be re-advertised, evaluated, and awarded within the next 4 months, because we want to mitigate the lost time and the lost opportunities. We're very much alive to the fact that infrastructure development is a flywheel through which government wants to restore economic activity, enable economic recovery. So we can't waste any further time. That is why board is directed that within 4 months we should have completed the process. And these are tenders that would normally take anything from 8 months onwards.
And what were the tenders for, by the way?
It's 5 tenders. One is the mega bridge project in the Eastern Cape, Mtentu Bridge. We've got Ibiklute in KZN, we've got Ashburn, Matatiele Road, and of course the open road tolling Chifip in Gauteng.
All right. Is there any conversation about anybody being held accountable for these directives from the board not necessarily being met? Or is this, I guess, an irregularity in the process again that would just have to be improved in, I guess, in the future to prevent something like this from taking place?
Now, in the public service, when such a thing has happened, consequence management must kick in. It is not something that board or management say, well, it's happened, let's improve. So board yesterday in the press conference actually did indicate that it will set in motion an objective process that will seek to get to the bottom of this, why it happened and how it happened. And if there's evidence that there was willful negligence or violation of a board resolution, then consequence management will kick in.
All right. With these tenders being issued in 4 months, is there a timeline of when you expect the infrastructure itself to have been completed? Keeping in mind, of course, that this too would have to be shifted because, you know, these tenders, again, as you mentioned, go back, I think, before January 2020, it was you mentioned.
Well, in terms of start of the actual work, that is going to depend on how the bidders respond. One can't impose that. Before a project starts, there's a lot that needs to happen. The mobilization of resources, a site must be set up. So all those things must be factored in. It would be premature to say now that construction work is going to start on such and such a date.
Sure. Are those people who bid for the tenders in the first round eligible to bid again?
Oh, yes, they are, most definitely. There's nothing that disqualifies them.
All right. Vusi Mona, thanks very much for your time. Really appreciate it. Vusi Mona speaks for Sanral, and this is on the back of 5 tenders amounting to, I think it's about 17.4 billion rand having to have been cancelled because the board had picked up on certain directives that they weren't comfortable with, directives, I should say, that weren't implemented, even though the board had asked for those directives to be seen through. That process essentially starting again, and we're told that those tenders should be issued in 4 months for new bidding to take place around major infrastructure in the country. We'll keep watching that story, certainly an important one considering the impact that infrastructure build has on growing the South African economy.